Hello, everybody. So we're gonna go over a very quick introduction to physiology. I'm gonna focus on homeostasis, really, though. That's gonna be my main point, though. But this is gonna be introduction to physiology, chapter 1. Okay. So we're gonna talk about physiology of the integrative sciences, as it is an integrative science, right? Function, mechanisms, some themes, homeostasis and control systems and homeostasis. Okay. So physiology, right? It's gonna be an integrative science, right? Where we have complex systems that will possess emergent properties, the integration of function across many levels of organization. This is what we're going to be studying, right? So complex systems, these are going to possess those emergent properties, right? And so physiology is going to be closely tied, obviously, with anatomy, right, at all levels of organization. So we know the anatomy is going to be looking at like the structure, right? And physiology tends to look at the function. Right, so physiology defined, right, is going to be the study of the normal functioning, right? So normal functioning of the living organism and its component parts. Okay, it's going to include all of its chemical and physical processes, right? So the study of physiology, again, closely related to anatomy that we know. And so the organization of life, right, when we look at that, we know that the cell is going to be the smallest unit of structure capable of carrying out life processes. Right, we know that atoms make up molecules, molecules then make up cells, cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, organs make up organ systems, and these organ systems together make up the whole organism, right? So if we just look at the levels of organization and the related fields of study, right, we know that physiology is a huge span, right, encompassing chemistry, molecular biology, cell biology, and even like ecology, right, at that organismal level. Right, so these are just the different organ systems that we'll look at this semester. Integumentary system, right, consisting of skin, hair, nails. Musculoskeletal system, that's going to support the body and provide body movement, right? Respiratory or pulmonary system, helping with the exchange of gases. The digestive or gastrointestinal system, right? We're going to take up nutrients, including water, and remove waste. Right, we have the renal system or the urinary system that's going to remove water and waste material. The reproductive system, producing those gametes, the egg and sperm. We have the cardiovascular system or the circulatory system, rather, right? That's going to distribute materials by pumping blood through vessels, right? We have the nervous system that's going to coordinate body functions, as well as the endocrine system that's going to also coordinate body functions. We have the immune system, which includes the lymphatic system, right? So we know that lymphatic is also part of the circulatory system, but it's going to be within the immune organ system, right? And that's going to help to protect the body from foreign substances, right? And this is just a better image with a diagram of the various systems, okay, and what they include and their function, right? So in physiology, one of the best ways to study physiology, right, and learn, excuse me, is to develop structure function maps. And these will show like the relationship between anatomical structures and their functions, right? So we can include atoms, molecules, cells, tissues, and organs, right? But it's really, we see the structure, and let's give the function, right? And it's really drawing it out, right? Writing it out. That will help. Even process maps or flow charts, right? Which is a diagrammatic illustration of the processes in a sequence. That's wonderful as well, right? So even in this example right here, this mapping example right here, using the sandwich, right? So we know the outside components, the bread, or tortilla wrap, right? And then we have the inside filling, the vegetable, cheese, meat, dressings and sauces, things like that. So think about, we can change this to like the cell, right? Outside component, what would that be? Cell membrane, right? Cell membrane consists of lipids, right? Proteins, right? Carbohydrates, right? The inside of the cell, right? Or the filling of the cell, right? That's going to be like the cytoplasm. All right, what's inside the cytoplasm? We got the nucleus inside the cell. We got mitochondria inside the cell. We got the Golgi inside the cell. We got the endoplasmic reticulums inside the cell. So doing something like this, right, it really does help, right? So I encourage this, right? Let's go back. And so even these process maps, right, these are a really good idea to use for physiology. So for example, right, hormones, right, we have, the hypothalamus, right, and we have the pituitary, right, and we have, for example, I'm just giving an example, right, what do I want to do? Let's just do thyroid gland, okay? There's so many options, right? But from the hypothalamus, we'll release, right, thyrotropinin releasing hormone, right? Thyrotropinin releasing hormone goes to the pituitary gland to release thyrotropin, or TSH, to then go to the thyroid gland to release T3, T4, calcitonin, right? So these concept maps like this, right, definitely works too, right? And these structure function maps definitely work too. So get in the use of using these, okay? So one of the main things that I'm going to stress, right, that you should really know and understand is that structure determines function. Structure determines function. Okay? I just want you to say it with me. Structure determines function. Okay? Really, really important. The way how a protein is structured, right, how it's shaped, will determine how that protein will respond and how it will react, right? How it will function in its environment. Okay? So remember that structure and function, these are going to be closely related, okay? And so within the body, right, in our internal environment, we have two things. We have an extracellular fluid and we have intracellular fluid, right? Extracellular fluid is extra, so it's outside the cell, right? Extracellular fluid is going to be that watery internal environment that surrounds the cell, right? So that extracellular fluid, that's going to either be the interstitial fluid, right? Or the other extracellular fluid that's outside the cell, right, would be plasma. Right? So those are the two forms of extracellular fluid. And intracellular fluid is going to be the fluid within the cell. Within the cell. Okay? And so it's that extracellular fluid, right, the ECF, is going to serve as a buffer zone between the outside world and the intracellular fluid. Okay? So if that's going to serve as a buffer zone, we need this extracellular fluid to be kept relatively stable. Okay, and that's when it comes in terms to homeostasis. When we talk about homeostasis, we're really talking about that extracellular fluid. Okay, the stability of the extracellular fluid compartment, right? And so homeostasis, I just mentioned it, right? Homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively stable internal environment, right? So again, this is the process of maintaining a stable internal environment, right? So homeo, right, means similar. Stasis means stable, right? So we want to have a stable, internal environment. Now there are going to be some critical factors, right? Everything in the outside world, right? The environment wants to not necessarily kill you, right? But there's going to be these environmental factors that will affect you, right? That's going to affect our cells, right? And so there's going to be critical variables that the materials for the cells need, right? Our cells are going to need certain things. And there's going to be factors that cells use to communicate with one another, right? So we want to keep things in a regulated range of values, right? So not like a single value, right? But a regulated range, right? So for example, you know how your average body temperature is around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's average, it's in the range, right? And a very specific set of range though, right? If you go out of that range, right, too far, right, then that's not conducive with life, right? And so unfortunately, a disease state or a pathological condition is a failure to maintain homeostasis. Right, and then we study that, right, studying the disease state of body functions, that's called pathophysiology, right? So diabetes mellitus is going to be a condition characterized by abnormal high blood glucose levels, right? The inability to maintain effective proper blood glucose levels, right? And so homeostasis, right, as we can see this example right here, right, as an organism in homeostasis, there's going to be some type of external stimuli, right, that's going to affect us, right? And then that will produce like an internal change. That internal change results in a loss of homeostasis. Now, there's two options, right? The organism really will attempt to compensate, right? If we are able to compensate, we're able to remain in a homeostasis, we are well. But if our compensation fails, right, that will lead to an illness or a disease, right? So homeostasis is going to depend on mass balance. So we're going to look at the law of mass balance. And that just simply states that if the amount of a substance in the body is to remain constant, any gain must be offset by an equal loss. Okay? So, excuse me. Any type of, so for example, you take in water, right? The intake of water, whether it's, through the intestines, lungs, the skin, it must be offset, right? Or for us to remain constant, we need to have an offset of equal loss, right? Equal loss of that fluid, of that water, right? For example, by excretion in the kidneys, the liver, the lungs, the skin, things like that, right? Homeostasis, right, also depends on the mass balance that we just mentioned. Mass flow, right? So mass flow is going to be the rate of transport of a substance through the body or into or out of the body, right? So excretion, right, that's going to clear substances from the body, right? So clearance is the volume of blood cleared of a substance per unit time, right? So how much of this drug is going to be cleared, right, in a specific amount of time. Right? So homeostasis doesn't necessarily mean equilibrium, though, right? So understand that. It does not mean equilibrium. So we know that the plasma is going to be the fluid component of blood, right? We want to maintain a dynamic, steady state, right? So materials are constantly moving between two compartments. So you have things moving inside the cell, things moving outside the cell, right? Equilibrium refers to these compartments are identical, right? But they're not the same as a steady state. Right, so we have the same amount of glucose inside the cell versus the same amount of glucose outside the cell. Right, homeostasis attempts to maintain a dynamic, steady state. Right, so a flow, really, right, a constant movement of materials between two compartments. Right, and so this is termed disequilibrium. So homeostasis equals disequilibrium. Okay, constant moving of materials between two compartments. Right, so this is gives us a good example of the steady state disequilibrium. So if we look at the concentrations of different ions in the extracellular fluid compared to the intracellular fluid, we're going to find a higher amounts of sodium and chloride ions in the extracellular fluid outside the cell compared to potassium. We're going to find a higher concentration of potassium inside the cell versus sodium and chloride. Right? But of course, to maintain a steady state disequilibrium, right, we're going to have materials, moving constantly between two compartments, between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. However, we are going to maintain a higher concentration of sodium and chloride in the extracellular fluid, and we're going to maintain a higher concentration of potassium inside the cell in the intracellular fluid. Okay? So to maintain homeostasis, the human body is going to monitor certain key functions, right, such as blood pressure, blood glucose, things like that, that must stay within a particular operating range if the body is to remain healthy, right? Temperature has to be maintained within a particular operating range for us to remain healthy, right? So these regulated variables are going to be kept within a normal range by control mechanisms. Your body has thousands of control mechanisms to keep these variables near a set point or at an optimal value, right? So we have control systems in the body. Excuse me, we have local and we have reflex systems, right? They're all going to consist of really the same thing. We're going to have an input signal, right? That's going to get interpreted in an integrating center, right? The brain, the spinal cord, things like that. And then we're going to have an output signal, right? That will produce some type of response, right? So we're going to look at that a little bit more. So local control is restricted to a tissue or a cell, like it's going to be localized, right? In a reflex control, this is where it's going to use long distance signaling, right? So in reflex control, cells at a distant site controls the response, right? So hormones, for example, will control the response, or even the brain, right, will evaluate, right, some type of change and initiate a response. And that response can be initiated, obviously it's going to come from the brain, but it can initiate a response to tell your foot to move, right? So using a long distance signaling pathway, right? And this is typically going to be the use of a response loop, and it's going to be indicative of nervous and endocrine systems, okay? So a physiological reflex, right? It can be broken down into two types, or two parts, I should say. Response loops, right? So response loops begin with a stimulus. And then feedback loops will modulate that response loop, okay? So we have a stimulus, a sensor, an input signal, the integrating center, an output signal, a target, like cell, right? And then we're going to have a response, right? So the response tends to feed back to influence the input portion of the pathway, right? So feedback loops will modulate the response loop. So we have negative feedback loops. Negative feedback loops are homeostatic, right? They stabilize that variable, whereas positive feedback loops are not homeostatic. They kind of reinforce or amplify that signal or that variable, okay? And we also have feed-forward control. Feed-forward control, these are special, right? Because they allow the body to anticipate change, right? These are anticipatory reflexes, okay? So a negative feedback loop that we said, right? Negative feedback loops are homeostatic. They stabilize a variable, right? So negative feedback loops can restore the normal state, but they cannot prevent that initial disturbance, right? So if we look at this figure right here, figure 1.11, the oscillation around the set point. So most functions that maintain homeostasis, they're going to have a set point or a normal value. So that response loop that controls the function is going to activate when the function moves outside, right, of that predetermined normal range, right? So for example, if your temperature, right, you want to remain in this set point, right? I'm sorry, in this range, right? And if we can remain in this range, we're good. But if we go out of this range, right, then we have issues, right? So I wanted to give an example, of homeostasis, right? So we know, again, homeostasis is, let's just write it out, the process of maintaining a stable internal environment. Okay, that's what homeostasis is, right? So when we're looking at a negative feedback loop, right? So let's focus on a negative feedback loop. Okay, it's going to start off, everything is going to start off with, this is number one, a stimulus, right? So say, for example, we are outside, right? It's hot, right? Super, in Texas, right? Super hot, right? In the heat in July, right? Or even June or August, right? Of Texas, right? So that stimulus would be an increase in temperature, right? That increase in temperature, right? We can feel that, right? It's going to go to a receptor. It's going to lead to a receptor, right? And specifically, we're going to have thermoreceptors, right? It's going to go to a thermoreceptor. That receptor is going to pick up that heat index and say, hey, oh my gosh, it's hot, right? That receptor is going to pick up that, say it's hot, and it's going to send it to an afferent signal, right? So through an afferent signal, this is going to travel toward the control center, right? And that control center is going to go to the control center. right? And that's going to be, right, the brain in this case, right? The brain is going to say, oh my gosh, okay, this is the integrating center as well, right? So let's put integrative center, right? It's going to interpret that information, and then what it's going to do is it's going to send information through an efferent signal, right? And this is going to go away from the control center, right? Where's it going to go? It's going to go to an effector, right? An effector tissue, right? And specifically, if your temperature is high, your brain is going to say, okay, well, let's send information to sweat glands, right? So you can sweat, right? So that you start to sweat, that breeze will swipe away that heat radiating from your body, and then that will produce an outcome, right, of lower temperature, right? So this, again, is a negative feedback loop, because what you started with was a different color, right? What you started with was an increase in temperature, right? But your outcome is the opposite, which is a decrease in temperature, right? So this is a negative feedback, right? This is negative feedback. And so what negative feedback does is it negates or opposes the stimulus. Okay? It negates or opposes the stimulus. Okay? So, say for example, we were in the same case, right? Same exact thing. So let me try to. Oh, perfect. It erased. Right? Let me use a different color though. Say for example, it was opposite, right? Say for example, you were cold now, so your body is experiencing a decrease in temperature. Right now, you're up in the north in Pennsylvania, right, and it's cold in January, right? So your body notices, oh, there's a decrease in temperature, right? We're cold. The same exact steps would apply, right? It's gonna have that stimulus being cold, right? A drop in temperature, right? Gonna send that through a thermoreceptor, right? A thermoreceptor is going to pick that information up, send it through an afferent signal, go toward the brain. The brain is going to send that information down to an effector tissue. Typically, in this case, is going to be your muscles, right? Right? It's going to tell your muscles to contract, relax, right? Basically, shivering, right? It's going to tell your muscles to contract, relax. That's going to produce shivering, right? And the outcome will be to increase your temperature, right? Again, opposite from what we started with. Again, negative feedback. Okay. And so positive feedback now. Positive feedback loops are not homeostatic. They kind of reinforce the stimulus rather than decreasing or removing it, right? So they amplify that stimulus. So for example, right, in this right here with the baby, right, dropping, right? So in a positive feedback loop, the response sends a regulated variable even further from its normal value, right? So in this example here, right, again, we have, right, can we use the same example, right? We still have a stimulus, right? But however, when the baby is dropping, right, can we use orange or yellow, all right? So that stimulus for a baby, right, the baby's head is going to stretch the cervix, right? The cervix is going to be the neck of the uterus, right? So the baby's head stretches the cervix, right? This is going to be picked up or received by those stretch receptors, right, in the cervix. Okay, it's going to send that information through an afferent signal, right, toward the control center. In this case, right, it's going to go to the brain, specifically the hypothalamus. right? And so the hypothalamus is then going to send, right, oxytocin. It's going to release oxytocin, right? Release oxytocin in the bloodstream, right? So send that through an efferent signal, and this is going to be that oxytocin flowing in the bloodstream, right? Where is it going to send it to? Well, it's going to send it to the uterus, right? It's going to send it to the uterus, and that oxytocin, remember the effects of oxytocin is going to cause that uterus to contract, right? And so what happens is that baby's head, right? Jupiter's head is pushing even more on the cervix, thus stimulating that stretch receptors even more, sending that information to the hypothalamus to release even more oxytocin, right? To have even more contraction to ultimately push this baby out, okay? So this is called positive feedback, right? This is positive feedback. And so the outcome actually amplifies the stimulus, right? It amplifies the stimulus, okay? And then we have feed forward control systems. And so feed forward control allows the body to anticipate change, right? So negative feedback loops can stabilize a function and maintain it within a normal range, but it is unable to prevent the change that triggered the reflex in the first place. Now, a few reflexes have evolved that enable the body to predict that a change is about to occur and start a response loop in anticipation of that change, right? So these anticipatory responses, these are going to be called feed forward control, right? And so an easily understood physiological example of feed forward control is the salivation reflex, right? So the sight, smell, or even the thought of food is enough to start our mouths to water, right? In expectation of eating the food, right? And so this reflex is going to extend even further because the same stimuli can start the secretion of hydrochloric acid as the stomach anticipates food is on its way, right? So these are one of those great anticipatory mechanisms to say, hey, oh, I'm about to eat, right? So let's start the production of hydrochloric acid so we can actually break this food down, right? These are great evolutionary advances, right? But this is just a quick overview of chapter 1, right? An introduction to physiology. Okay,